So today I'm counting down my top 10 best of all time personal favorite lead guitar players. Okay, right about now you might be wondering, why the f does this guy always sit in his car to record his videos? Well, let's just say I've got some complicated things going on at home. My wife hasn't been feeling the best for a while, and I try to give her as much space as I can. Try not to bother her with shooting videos and things like that wherever possible. So if I get a car, in the car is just, it's fine. It'll do for now. But yeah, as soon as I can, I'll get back to, filming normally. Anyway, I figured I would start with a few honorable mentions, people that didn't quite make the list, either because their impact on me wasn't quite as direct as the people who are in the main top 10 list, or maybe I've come to them later in life, so they haven't really influenced me from the ground up, shall we say. But there are certainly players that I would look up to and respect, and I'm influenced by more recently, if that makes sense. They didn't really inform the shape of my sound as it was, or as it's been up until now. That's probably fair. So the first one I'm going to put on the list is MarkKnopfler. I grew up with loads of Dire Straits being played in house. My dad always had it on, and other family members had it on. And I was always like kind of seeing like live VHSs. Do any of you know what a VHS is? I know some of my viewers will definitely recall VHS and grew up with it. But yeah, I was always inspired by, Mark's unique phrasing. Obviously, being a fingerstyle player. Having a strong background in that sort of like Dixie Town kind of sound. Obviously his relationship with Chet Atkins and people like that obviously inspired his playing. But obviously he brought a lot of technique that I guess you'd find in that sort of style, and on particularly on acoustic guitar, but he brought that to the electric guitar and did some really unique and memorable things with it. There's some particular tracks that spring to mind that really inspire me to this day, particularly in terms of orchestration as well. He's a really fantastic writer and orchestrator and arranger of music. Telegraph Road is one that really springs to mind, and Private Investigations as well. And obviously he also came up with some really memorable riffs, and particularly with his little fills and things that you'd put, between his vocal lines. They're so memorable and so vocal and relatable, and his technique I just think is beautiful, and as well as the tone. But things like obviously Sultans of Swing being a big one, Money for Nothing. I think Money for Nothing is one of the key songs that probably inspired me to even think about picking up an electric guitar. I mean, it's hard not to rock out to that. Next on my list is Richie Cotton. Player, again, fingerstyled, but much more extreme interpretation, much more rock focused interpretation. God, I mean, the guy can really shred. It's incredible what he does with his fingers. Fantastic nuance, fantastic style, great tone as well, really unique tone. It's not super over the top gamey, and yet what he manages to pull out of, considering he's using fingers, the amount of like bite and aggression and snarl that man gets out of a guitar is really impressive. But obviously, I mean, the way he uses his gear and the way he digs into the guitar, he's one of those players that obviously you see him using Strats and Tellys, and those guitars are really good for like kind of really digging into the note a bit. But yeah, I mean, it's particularly his work with Winery Dogs. He's more of one of those guys that's more of a recent influence on me. But songs like Elevate, Oblivion, those sorts of things come to mind first, the real kind of rockers. But I also really like some of the funky kind of stuff. He's really a soulful player, I think, at heart. You can tell that in the way he sings. It kind of reminds me of like Chris Cornell or someone like that as well. He's got that real soulful kind of vibe. Something like Hot Streak, you know, is kind of what I'm getting at here. Next on my list of honorable mentions is Christopher Amit. Younger brother of Michael Hammett from Arch Enemy, or Arch Enemy, however you want to say it. I tend to call them Arch Enemy, but sheer speed, fluidity. Fluidity is a real keyword for me when it comes to Christopher's playing. Again, but his articulation is so precise. His runs, in terms of the melodic sense as well, they really paint a picture. They really bring a lot of vibrance and energy to that act. And in particular, the Tyrants of the Rising Sun DVD, I thought there was a real special chemistry that they had in the band at that time. Obviously they had Angela on vocals and Chris was in the band, and that show is so energetic, it's so pumped up, and it, from the first song to the very last song, it just absolutely mows you down. It's such an impressive show. Such a fortunate thing to have captured that on a DVD, I think. Next on my list would be Neely Brosh. Israeli guitar player. I think anyone here is into kind of virtuosic playing will know of her. She's played with Steve Vai, she's played with Tony McAlpine, she's got her own solo records out. If you follow her, you'll know she does a big Cirque du Soleil shows as well. Really cool. She kind of reminds me of, like, she's like today's Jennifer Batten. That's kind of how I like to think of her. And of course there's many great female guitar players that have emerged in, you know, the last couple of decades, but Neely is the one that I follow closest. I got her record, A Matter of Perception, and it's fantastic. It's full of delicate nuance and detail and great tones, and just that kind of polished runs that, you know, that you would expect from the top echelon of players. And the title track itself, man, that is like a crunchy, slamming, full-on cool metal track with interesting time signatures and just cool changes, and, you know, from one bar to another, the way the song moves. She's pretty eloquent on the instrument, so really respect her. Alexi Laiho. Formerly, you know, Children of Bottom, obviously rest in peace. Again, same thing, fluidity. It's very similar to Chris Hammett for me in terms of what I draw from him, but again, it's the fluidity with which he played. I really liked his kind of take on how he would deploy a kind of neoclassical metal and rock style. Obviously, he's, you know, quite the sweeper. In terms of his, you know, sweep picking and arpeggios and that sort of thing. But I feel really bummed that we never really got to see, someone like him as he aged, sort of past past his 40s into his 50s into his 60s, that kind of thing. Because somebody who's that good, that young, they can only get better. And so you can't help but wonder, where could he have gone with his playing, particularly outside of metal maybe, and seeing what would he have done later in life. It's a real shame we lost him when we did. But yeah, I'm thinking on their earlier records, Follow the Reaper, stuff like that, particularly his precision in his use of like pinch harmonics. He found ways to get this real extremism in his sound, and it would just be kick ass. That's the best way to describe his playing. It was just kick ass. The last one I'm going to put on the list, obviously I'm not leaving out players like Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck wasn't a massive direct influence on me, and he influenced so many people, so I'm not going to skip him off the list. But Jeff Beck is something I couldn't really grasp him when I was younger. It's only in more recent years where I've been able to really listen properly and understand how special he was. The last one on this list is Kirk Hammett. And yeah, this might be a bit contentious. When I talk about it, Kirk Hammett, I'm referring to 80s Kirk Hammett through to about mid-90s, late 90s tops. Anything from the noughties onwards, and I've fallen out with Kirk. Lovely guy and all, but I just think he's been lazy. But when you go back and you look at something like the Live in Seattle show, or the Live in San Diego show, and obviously listening even up to Load and Reload, the kind of lead work that he was doing, Kirk was a tasteful player. He was a tasteful player, and he wasn't the most complicated of players in terms of his licks. So they weren't the hardest ones to play, but I think they're actually some of the hardest ones to play just right, because they really depend on being played just right, which is why it's so annoying when he doesn't play them just right. But God, he's penned some classic solos, and all through my youth, definitely one of those players that really inspired me. I spent a long time trying to decide whether I wanted to be Hetfield or Hammett. I'd look at them on the face of Guitar Play magazine or Guitar World magazine or something like that. They'd be on the cover, and I'd be like, oh, but James has his guitar down really low, and he's tall, and I wish I was tall and imposing. But Kirk's like small, but he's agile and he's fast, and that kind of thing. But anyway, things change and things move on. So he's on my honorable mention list, but he's not on my main top 10 list. Right, let's get moving to the top 10. Let's get stuck into it. Okay, so for the main top 10 list, I'm starting off with a blues player, and I don't go for blues very often, particularly slower blues. Doesn't really float my boat. And Hendrix was largely before my time, although I'm very strongly aware of his work, of course. But the player who most fired me up and inspired me when it came to a blues player, and all of that comes down to the feel, the expression, being in the pocket, the attack on the strings, that kind of bite and attitude and snappiness to their playing. And it's all about the character, and of course the look is really important. Blues players got to look a certain way, right? They got to look like they're the blues, right? But of course this would be Stevie Ray Vaughan. his work, you know, with his brother in Double Trouble is just, it's the only blues I can listen to, like, you know, sit there and listen to like a full show, or listen to a whole CD worth of that, you know, like an hour and a half or whatever it is of music. But yeah, just raw tone. There was something really raw, visceral, and animalistic, I guess, about how he played his guitar, how he really attacked it and bit into it. And he's one of the few people I think that's truly channeled Hendrix really well. So when he's done covers and things like that, you know, like Voodoo Child, Slight Return, that springs to mind first. But I've heard a lot of covers of that, and lots of people can play it really well. But for me, actually, the Stevie Ray Vaughan version is the version, for me personally. That's the way I hear it. Also, fantastic singing voice. And cool as you like. I mean, like, that man had some great hats and some great boots. Next on my list is Tony McAlpine. Is there Alpine? Is there anything Tony can't play? You know, fantastic keyboard player, pianist, really, concert pianist level of player. But in terms of his work on guitar, I think what drew me to Tony McAlpine, I was first made aware of him by seeing him play with Steve Vai. And of course, there's very few people who can go toe to toe, like truly go toe to toe on the guitar with Steve Vai. And he's one of those guys who can go at that level with Steve, and that's obviously really enjoyable to hear and witness. But that caused me to go and have a listen to his catalog, and really he's got quite a lot of strong kind of metal sensibility, and I really like what he does with that, with his heavier tracks. And he's wicked when it comes to time signatures, and again with his phrasing. He's also got quite a unique tone. He's not one of those guys that kind of tries to just make everything big at the same time. Rather, he seems to like everything to have its place. And I think that shows that, you know, there's obviously a real mature mindset involved there, to set your ego aside a little bit, I guess, when it comes to those things, in order for the bigger picture to work. So there's a lot of levels that I really respect his playing on. But yeah, fantastic player. If you don't know him, you should go check him out, because he's deadly. Next on my list is Essan. Formerly of Emperor, now obviously flying solo mostly, but he still does the odd show with Emperor, which is really cool. What I really like about Essan is his sense of melody. He writes these intricate melodies. They don't just, it's not just a single line melody and then it turns around on the 4, you know, or it turns around on the 8. Often they're written like classical pieces of music. It's like you'll have a melody that is continuously changing across an entire verse or an entire chorus, whatever the part is. But it's not, you know, he's less riff focused. And it's one of those things, I've always found myself trapped in this thing of like, I always riff out, you know, it's always, the part always turns around and repeats. And it's like, I wish I could do what he does, where he doesn't repeat himself very often. He has these long, intricate lines. I'm like, how does he remember that? But it's not just that, it's also In terms of the way he tackles his solos and any lead lines in particular, he's able to express a real carnal kind of primal darkness and a sense of chaos and of torture in his playing. But at the same time, there's also like a beauty, a contrast of a beauty with it. Songs like Elegy of Icaros spring to mind when it comes to the more kind of beautiful and grandiose sounds, and when it comes to, like, you know, the darker, twisted, tortured, chaotic sounds, I'm thinking like I Am the Black Wizard, like just absolute ferocity in that song. But from his modern stuff, I mean, if you listen to Until I Too Dissolve, he shows as well that he can write this, like, just a really kick-ass rock song with kind of a rock riff that's just, you know, it just blasts out the speakers and announces itself, and it's just like, here we go, we're gonna just kick ass. Not to say that that isn't an intricate song, it sure is, but the main hooks of it are just that, they're very hooky. So he can do quite a lot of different things. I really respect him for that. There's a lot of diversity in his sound. Next on my list is Paul Gilbert. And you might find some of my tastes a bit old school. Well, just deal with it. Paul Gilbert's like a walking song library. I mean, geez, is there any song that guy doesn't know? I've never really seen him get stumped, or very seldom. He has this absolutely stunning sense of melodic perception in terms of, you know, his note selection, and the way he attacks each note is quite delicate. It's he's very intentful. Yeah, so, you know, if he's playing through a line and then it goes into, you know, kind of major feel where it's, you know, it's brighter and happier, his picking attack will change to suit that nuance. Not just in a basic way where it's just, you know, neck to bridge, yeah, picking attack. It literally how much he digs in, where he's digging in, and it will match the coloration of the melody and the harmony that he's playing at the time. You know, he's one of those people who's really in tune with his instrument. Obviously, he's technically dazzling. If you listen to, you know, Scarified or something like that, you know, when he's doing the faster stuff, it's almost kind of neoclassical type stuff. The precision in his picking, his alternate picking, is just ruthless, right? And he's fast as hell. Anyone who's seen, you know, what he's done over the years, he's a rapid player, but he has great tone and, like I said, great nuance. He's a fantastic teacher as well, really amazing communicator to people, and really down to earth, and really, I think he helps the students really get to the core of what it is they need to do to, like, make a breakthrough or to reap the biggest reward that they can. I really respect that. Not everyone can teach. It's one thing being able to play really shit hot. It's another thing being able to raise somebody up to your level. Next on my list is Marty Friedman. Now, Now remember, this list is kind of in order of their impact on me as well. It's not just a competitive thing about who's got the best chops, okay? So Marty Friedman's next on my list. He's a super identifiable and memorable player. You can't mistake anyone for Marty Friedman, and you won't mistake Marty Friedman for anybody else. His note selection, his tone, everything is super identifiable. You know immediately when he's playing. And it's particularly between his main phrases. You know, I'm thinking of, say, Symphony of Destruction, or any of his solos, really. You know, he'll have these great lines, and it might be a great rock line, and it in itself, say it's an arpeggio run or something like that, they sound great as it is, but it's what he does when he moves from one of those runs into the next run. It's the little bends and slides in between. That's an important part of his phrasing and character that cannot be replicated, and it's essential. And it's like he can't play a bad note. There's no note he can play that's wrong. It's only a tone on his way to the next tone, if that makes sense. Just incredible. But yeah, obviously standout solos: Tornado of Souls, Tout le Monde, and like I said, Symphony of Destruction. There's many. I mean, I'm not going to mention them all, but next on my list is Dimebag Darrell. And how we miss him. Dimebag, there's a couple of things that spring to mind. First off, such an extreme sound in terms of what he's able to achieve, and he could do that with just the guitar and the amp, if that makes sense, and his hands. Adding the whammy bar in, and adding the whammy pedal in, and adding wah in was just icing on the top. But he was able to do all of this stuff with his hands. But he actually had extremely clever lead composition and song composition, and again, somebody who managed to incorporate into metal very country-esque bending strategies on his instrument, and like the way he'd attack a pentatonic, for instance, but somehow he'd make that sound extreme rather than making it sound cringe. And I don't know how, because most players, if they try to do that, it would just be absolute garbage. You know, it's like the last two genres you think would pair together properly. But he's both epic and brutal and beautiful. Obviously, songs that spring to mind, highlights for me, fucking Hostile, Domination. Domination is like one of my favorite solos ever. And now on the more beautiful side, obviously you've got This Love, and you've got Floods. Floods for me is just, it's one of those tracks that just moves me every time. Okay, so next up on my list, I've got John Petrucci. I mean, what can you say about John Petrucci? It's basically impossible to fault. From the outside, it's like, I'm sure he feels like he messes things up, but from the outside, it's like flawless technique. It's basically, it sounds flawless. But my thing that, you know, John Petrucci, when I first heard him, I actually thought he sounded kind of clinical. It took me a bit of getting into to really understand what he was doing. But the other thing is he's changed over time. He's a player who evolves, and I think it's one of the things that I really appreciate about him the most is he never really stands still. He never rests on his laurels. He still practices. He explores new instruments. He develops new instruments, and he truly innovates. It's not just I'll slap my name on it and give it a different color. There's truly different and new concepts, new body shapes, new contouring, new neck profiles, new pickups, you know, everything from the ground up. The way he works with boogie, with the amps, and everything is like to the nth degree of detail. It's original stuff. But yeah, so he searches for tone, and he's got every minute in the world to sit down and geek out with like guitar players about gear. I love that. He's just like super approachable. But yeah, I mean, he plays obviously some insane shred lines. His ability with complex time signatures and things like that, I mean, you don't really need to say anymore if you've heard Dream Theater. Whether they're your cup of tea or not, you have to respect what they're technically capable of. But I actually find he develops or delivers very emotive performances, particularly as he's gone on with time. He always had chops, but his ability to dig deep and emote, and I think his ability to actually enjoy his playing in the moment seems to have increased over time, which makes sense. But yeah, he's basically like a fine wine. He's just getting better with age. But yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of songs like Under a Glass Moon. That solo just hits me every time, just floors me. Overture 1928, I love that as an instrumental. It's just unbelievable. Sacrifice Sons, an incredibly emotional and moving song. And Octavarium, which has so many different facets. It's so complex, it's just ridiculous. And say a song like The Best of Times, I mean, that's an important song for Mike Portnoy. It's a lot of it is to do with his relationship with his father and losing his father. And that kind of thing really needs to be handled like delicately. And that's exactly the kind of treatment that John Petrucci gives to that sort of thing. And you really get sucked into feeling, I guess, a small smattering of what Mike Portnoy must have been feeling when they wrote that, or around that time. It's absolutely incredible. His ability to break down the barrier between the musician and the consuming audience is impeccable. Just one final point to add about John Petrucci. Oh yeah, through the power of post-production, wardrobe change. Anyway, Dream Theater was originally meant to be called Majesty. It was called Majesty, and it was later changed to Dream Theater. But the idea was they wanted a majestic sound. The thing about John Petrucci is his musical vocabulary is so developed, it's so wide, it's so broad, that he can express whatever he really wants to through the instrument. And, you know, so there's very few boundaries left in his way in terms of communicating with the audience. But one thing that he does incredibly well, if the promise is to sound majestic, well, that's John Petrucci in a nutshell, isn't it? Majestic. Right, so Eddie Van Halen comes in at my number 3 spot. There's a few reasons for this. Eddie Van Halen, I mean, God, his whole attitude. The guy was always smiling and upbeat. I mean, I'm sure he had bad days and got angry with people and stuff like that, but generally, whenever you saw him playing, he always had a smile on his face. It was like he was just so happy to be on a stage playing music. And I think because of this kind of exuding this kind of joy and the sense of fun, really, Van Halen shows, especially back in the day, when you look at them, it just screams of having fun, having a good time, you know. And that's not to say that the songwriting doesn't have any depth. Obviously, in the early days, there's a lot of like tongue-in-cheek type stuff. You know, but later on in their career, there's definitely a lot of depth there as well. But nevertheless, the vibe on stage was always just fun and kind of shenanigans. That was the kind of vibe. And yeah, it's hard not to find that whole thing infectious. The other thing was, yeah, like I said, his songcraft. I mean, everything from, you know, if we're talking like just outright soloing prowess, obviously you've got to mention Eruption. And there's various different performances of it, and they're all kind of unique in and of themselves. You know, hearing the one on the record was a game changer in the first place. But then seeing what he would take that and do with it live, it was always there was always something a little bit like reinvented about Eruption whenever he played it. And there were some performances that are arguably better than others, but they're all pretty stellar, really. You know, and then just thinking about songs like Panama and Hot for Teacher, I mean, if those things don't get you pumped up as a guitar player, then you must be dead inside, quite honestly. And then later on you've got songs like Jump, which is, you know, it's kind of, you know, it's definitely on the pop side of rock, but God, what a solo. And fits perfectly with the vibe in terms of what he wrote on the keyboards, and obviously an established pianist as well. So, you know, all round musicianship, really, really high level. But it's really just comes down to his feel and his taste. And, you know, I've said this before, he's much more of a pentatonic player than most people know. And pentatonic, when it's done bad, is incredibly repetitive and boring. But pentatonic, when it's done really well with flair and style and taste, is a really, really, really good place to be, to sound really vocal. And if it sounds really vocal, audiences can relate to it and they can sing along to it. And with a lot of Eddie's solos, despite the fact that there's complexity and nuance in them, they're super memorable, and most audience members, whether they're guitar players or not, really look forward to the solo, like genuinely look forward to the moment where he's going to kick in and do his thing and take the song to new heights. And I think that's kind of, you know, that's the takeaway, that when Eddie rocked up on the scene with his sound, with his interpretation of tapping, and not just the tapping, but the way he used natural harmonics, the way he used pinch harmonics, there's his use of the whammy bar, his use of effects. The fact is that general audience members, like the whole audience, was behind the guitar player. You know, you rarely see that these days. You know, you might get people there that are guitar heads, or they're music, you know, music connoisseurs, or musicians even. And yeah, sure, they'll look forward to these key parts with various bands that they follow. But you have to go back to someone like Van Halen and that sort of generation, really, that sort of 80s generation, where the entire audience would be looking forward to see what the guitar player was going to do when it came time to throw down in a solo. And I think that's a big takeaway, is when people first heard Eddie, it was so shocking and so memorable. And I think that's the feeling that resonated with them. Like, wow, I really want to write something that's like a showstopper like that, you know? So yeah, let's move on to the next one though. Steve Vai.
This?
Mr. Boy, and I want it stopped. All got detention.
can you say about Steve Vai? I mean, he's a complete freakazoid. You know, his skill level on the instrument is basically God mode, isn't it, really? Again, a constant innovator, from developing amplifiers to obviously his signature guitars and signature pedals. You know, it kind of goes on and on, but he's had his fingers influence the design and course of like gear design over many decades now, and it's all like meaningful changes, if that makes sense, or meaningful innovation. So really respect that about him. But one of my favorite things about Steve is it's his ability to think outside of the box. You know, like he'll pull his whammy bar out and he'll use that as like a hammer, you know, to like hammer the strings like a piano hammer would hammer the strings, and combine that with slides, right, so that it's as if you've got a slide on your right hand rather than on your left hand, and get really quirky and strange vocal sounds that way. That's something I'd never seen anybody else do before, and I've not seen anyone else do it as fluently as him, besides him. But yeah, I mean, all you have to do is look up his history and, you know, see what he went through to, you know, get into Zappa's band and make his name. And you know, he's one of those people, he doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk, if that makes sense. He's everything that the legendary stories, you know, say that he is. He's just the real deal, and you can't really poke holes in anything that he does. And there's a couple of notable songs that like really just captivate me every time I hear them, and I look forward to them, and I can't go too much time without, you know, time going past without coming back to them and hearing them. And one of those is Building the Church. That intro tapping line with the really convoluted time signatures, which just blow my mind still to this day, and then launching into that really deep heavy riff, that crunching riff, and then into the atmospheric main melody line. The way it steps up through the keys and kind of builds into these crescendos, it's just fantastic. More recently, of course, you've got Teeth of the Hydra. Really love that song. And just when you thought that Steve Vai had kind of pushed out all the boundaries, here he turns up with this crazy instrument that's got, you know, the sex button or whatever it was. It's got a harp in it, it's a bass, it's you know, split neck, what was it, like 12-string guitar or 10-string or something like that neck on it, and then the regular, you know, 6-string, and he's playing leads, he's playing rhythms on it, he's playing acoustic parts on it, he's playing the bass line on it, he's playing the harp part on it. You know, there's just so much going on in that composition and the coordination to be able to do it. And what I love about him is his attitude is like, he'll imagine something. Oh, wouldn't it be cool, like, if you could have 4 arms to be able to do this, you know? And then he'll figure out a way to turn his 2 arms into 4 arms and develop a whole new instrument to make that possible, and you get something like Teeth of the Hydra. It's just ridiculous. And then there's, you know, tracks that are just super atmospheric and again, really vocal. I think that's something I like in guitar players that I listen to, is a sort of vocal quality to their playing. And Steve has that, definitely, like leaps and bounds. But a song like Ooh, I think, really showcases that. And again, it's kind of one of the, I guess, slightly more metal sounding songs. It's a little less typical, like everyone's kind of heard of Bad Horsey, but a song like Ooh is just, it's a little different. It's like really low and slow and deep and in the pocket, but it has all this incredible atmosphere that, you know, is panned off to the sides, that you can just kind of swim in this ocean of sound. So yeah, Steve Vai is definitely, is the maestro for me. Kicking in at number 1, you probably guessed it by now, is the only guy I haven't really mentioned, and I'm not mentioning a whole bunch of modern players, so I'm going old school again, but for me it's Joe Satriani. Joe's like, again, it's the nuance, it's the control, it's the consideration of tone, the hunting for tones. Also, something else to say is that, you know, this guy is the teacher of teachers, if that makes sense. So you've got guys like Paul Gilbert who are in awe of what Joe does when he hears it, you know. Steve Vai is, you know, one of Joe's students, and he still shows that respect despite his age. That, you know, he'll sort of tip his hat or bow to the master, you know. But Joe, at the end of the day, one of my favorite things about him is he's like this little freak alien guy, this like friendly alien from another planet. You know, he's literally not of this earth. But again, it's the joy that the guy exhibits when he plays. He's a supremely good communicator and a fantastic teacher, and he just seems like a fantastic human being. But I really love his use of the wah pedal, because he's so subtle with it. He can show such restraint with it, or he can be so extroverted with it. But he just exhibits the full range of what an effect like the wah can do. And for me, the wah is one of my favorite effects when used well. Obviously, newish like Kirk Hammett is just it's a complete shit show, if you ask me, for wah. Oftentimes, but someone like Joe, it's like it's beautiful, it's beautiful, it's smooth, it's just the right amount at the right time, it's the right amount of bite at the right time. It just takes it to the next level. And yeah, I mean, obviously he's got the licks as well to boot, you know. A lot of people, I think, you know, Joe included himself, he doesn't really think of himself so much as a shredder anymore. But the fact is, I mean, if you go see him live, you're going to hear stuff like Mystical Potato Head Groove Thing, where you're going to see the legato line, the single hand, you know, muted legato line. That stuff is still mind blowing. Crushing Day, you know, the song he famously wrote, that, you know, he wrote it sitting down, and later realized you can't play it standing up. And I'm thinking particularly the sort of really quick arpeggio section in the solo. But yeah, all it takes is like sitting down and listening to him play something like that, and realizing, like, you know, whatever the other guys can do, Joe can do it. You know. But it's his songcraft at the end of the day that just anyone can listen to Joe Satriani, and you can put that on, and it neither offends anyone, despite there being widdly diddly in it. It doesn't offend anyone, but it's like the perfect atmospheric music. And I'm thinking like a song like Driving at Night. I mean, that if that doesn't feel to you like driving in your car alone at night and just gunning it down like the highway or the back roads or something like that, I don't know what's wrong with you. You must be tone deaf. And he's actually written one of my favorite instrumentals of all time, which is a track called Lost in a Memory, which is off Shockwave Supernova. And I gotta say, I mean, that's the song for me. Like, it's going to be played at my wake, I think. I've never heard a piece like it. It moves me to such a deep level, makes me consider my own mortality. It's really, really deep stuff. It just hits me in an emotional way that few other pieces of music can. So yeah, that's it. That's my top 10 all-time best, most favorite guitar players as they influenced me, roughly in order of impact of influence. Let me know what you think in the comments. You know, who would you change on the list? What did you think of the honorable mentions? I know I've left people out. Guthrie Govan, I didn't forget him. He's probably had the least impact on me, despite how mind-blowing he is. But I'm really late to the Guthrie party. But yeah, anyway, go ahead, leave me a comment. Tell me what a noob I've been, who I've forgotten, all that kind of thing. And look, tip of the hat to people like Tosin Abasi and Tim Henson. They're fantastic technical guitar players, but I don't really relate to what they do on the instrument so much. So while I respect it and appreciate what it took them to create what they've created, it doesn't really resonate with me, and that's why they're not on the list. Okay, so I do like some new guitar players, but none of them have matched the guys I've mentioned in the way that they've had an impact on me. Anyway, so that's where I'm going to leave it. Like I said, leave me a comment, like, share, subscribe, do all those things if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.